My father waited until his 70th birthday cake had been cut before he placed a cream-colored folder beside my plate. I was 36 years old, and I had spent the previous 5 years being described as the daughter who had abandoned her family over a wedding bill. According to the version my parents repeated to relatives, I had canceled my wedding 23 days before it happened, disappeared, and left them responsible for $41,800. The part they usually left out was that my younger sister Paige had married my fiancé. Dad tapped the folder with 2 fingers. Inside was an agreement approving the private sale of my grandmother's lake cottage to Paige and Grant. Beneath my half of the purchase price was a deduction labeled Family Advance, $41,800. The final page waived my right to challenge earlier estate expenses. Paige lifted her wine glass from Grandma June's old chair. It's amazing who remembers they have a family when there's property to divide. A cousin looked down at his cake. My mother told Paige not to start, using the same gentle voice she always used when she wanted everyone to understand that Paige had already been forgiven. I closed the folder. I'm not signing this. Dad said the agreement would resolve 2 problems at once. The cottage would remain in the family, and the old wedding balance would finally be settled. I asked him which wedding he was charging me for. Mine had never happened. Paige's had. Grant sat beside her, tracing the edge of his napkin. He had been my fiancé until 23 days before our ceremony. Now he wore a wedding ring chosen by my sister and avoided looking at me in the dining room where my parents had once announced our engagement. Dad said I was reopening old wounds. I reminded him that he had placed a 5-year-old accusation inside a current estate document. He pushed the folder toward me again. It's only an acknowledgement of what happened. What had happened was exactly the problem. In my family, Paige was the daughter who needed understanding. I was the daughter who could handle things. That difference explained more than favoritism ever could. When Paige missed a tuition deadline, Mom called the registrar. When she quit 3 jobs in 1 year, Dad said she was trying to find the right fit. When she spent money she did not have, my parents called it a temporary problem. When I accepted a promotion in another city, Mom asked why I was never satisfied. When I declined a family request, somebody reminded me that I was the practical one. The compliment was always the same. Lena can handle it. By 31, I had built a career around that skill. I managed operations for a regional museum network in Virginia. My work involved contracts, vendors, budgets, schedules, permits, and the problems created when 5 people assumed somebody else had agreed to something. At work, unclear responsibility was a risk. At home, it was tradition. Grant and I had dated for 3 years before we became engaged. He was pleasant, attractive, and skilled at making passivity look like trust. I chose the venue. I compared vendors. I handled payments. He told people I had better taste and acted as though letting me do everything was a form of respect. My father offered $16,000 toward the wedding. Because he paid the venue deposit, Willow Creek House listed him as the contracting client. I paid $12,600 toward the florist, photographer, invitations, and catering installments. Paige volunteered to help. She attended tastings Grant claimed he was too busy to attend. She collected invitation samples and sat beside me during dress fittings. I thought she was trying to become closer to me. 7 months before my wedding, she had begun sleeping with Grant. My mother knew 2 weeks before I did. My father knew there was a problem but said he had been waiting for Grant to decide what he wanted. The morning after Grant ended our engagement, Paige came to my apartment with Mom. She cried before she sat down. She said she had not planned to fall in love with him. Then she asked whether they could use my wedding. The venue deposit was non-refundable. Relatives had purchased plane tickets. Flowers had been ordered. Paige said it would be wasteful to throw away an event when the family was already prepared to gather. She did not describe it as taking my wedding. She described it as preventing a financial loss. I told her no. Mom said I should not make expensive decisions while emotional. That afternoon, I emailed every vendor I had hired. I canceled my services and stated that I did not authorize my payments, photographs, designs, account access, or personal information to be transferred to another couple. The venue replied that my father controlled the master agreement. I forwarded the response to Dad and asked him to cancel. He called instead. He said Paige and Grant intended to marry eventually. Keeping the contract would stop a painful situation from becoming a total waste. I reminded him that some of my payments had already been credited to the venue account. He said we would sort out the money later. I sent one final email. I did not consent to my money being used for Paige and Grant's wedding. If the event continued, I wanted a complete accounting and reimbursement for every dollar of mine that benefited them. 6 days later, Dad signed an amendment replacing me with Paige. The wedding did not even happen on my original date. Paige moved it to October, increased the guest count, upgraded the menu, added a string quartet, and ordered a late-night dessert station. They were not quietly using my canceled event to avoid losing a deposit. They were building Paige's wedding inside a contract my father controlled. Invoices continued arriving in my email because nobody removed my address from the vendor portal. I saw each change as it happened. My parents asked me to attend. Dad said my absence would turn a private mistake into a public family rupture. Mom said people would ask questions and Paige did not deserve to be humiliated on her wedding day. I asked what they believed had happened to me. Mom said I was stronger than Paige. That was how the family justified almost everything. Paige's pain required protection. Mine proved that I could absorb more. I did not attend the wedding. I moved to Richmond 2 months later for a new position. I gave my parents my address and work email. I continued writing to Grandma June. I did not disappear. I stopped participating in conversations where my family had already chosen the conclusion. During the following year, I requested the wedding accounting 3 times. The first request received no response. The second produced a short email saying Dad had suffered substantial losses. The third came back with a spreadsheet listing $41,800 under the heading costs caused by Lena's cancellation. The amount included the original venue deposit, Paige's transfer fee, added chairs, the upgraded menu, the quartet, and the dessert station. They had charged me for additions to Paige's wedding. I sent Dad my bank records showing $12,600 in payments. I asked when that money would be returned. He replied that my figures ignored everything the family had done for me. After that, I stopped asking him directly. I preserved the records. 5 years later, the same invented debt was sitting beside my father's birthday cake, attached to my inheritance. Dad told me the agreement was fair. Paige said she had stayed near our parents and cared for Grandma during her final months. She said I had chosen distance and could not return only when there was something to collect. Some of what she said was true. Paige lived 15 minutes from Grandma. During Grandma's last year, she bought groceries, arranged yard work, and visited more often than I did. I had a full-time job 2 hours away and saw Grandma mostly on weekends. Paige had been present. That did not make the cottage entirely hers. It did not create a debt in my name. It did not turn my payments into a gift. I told Dad that any discussion about the estate would happen in writing and with my own counsel. He asked me to speak privately in his office. I refused. Private conversations were where clear statements became flexible memories. Paige shook her head and said I was proving everyone right. I stood, placed the unsigned agreement back inside the folder, and left it beside my cake plate. The family had spent 5 years saying I walked away from a debt. Now they needed my signature to prove it. They did not get it. Grandma June's cottage sat on Lake Anna, about an hour north of Richmond. It had been built in the 1970s and never fully updated. The screened porch leaned slightly toward the water. One kitchen drawer stuck during humid weather. The dock had been repaired so many times that no 2 boards were the same shade. Paige and I spent summers there when we were children. We learned to swim from the dock and slept in bunk beds during thunderstorms. The cottage was one of the few places where our family roles had once felt less fixed. Paige was not the fragile one there. I was not the responsible one. We were simply sisters who fought over the top bunk and checked each other's arms for mosquito bites. Grandma's will left the cottage to us equally. I did not learn that until her estate attorney contacted me after her death. By then, Paige and Grant had already decided they wanted it. They offered $400,000. A recent appraisal placed the cottage at $615,000. Paige argued that the lower amount reflected necessary repairs, avoided a broker's commission, and kept the property in the family. Dad, who served as personal representative of the estate, supported the offer. The proposed settlement gave me half of the discounted sale price and then deducted the $41,800. No promissory note was attached. No reimbursement agreement existed. There was no canceled check showing that Dad had paid money directly to me. The only description was wedding obligations satisfied by Robert Hart on behalf of Lena Hart. I objected to the deduction and the sale price in writing. I asked the estate attorney for the documents supporting both. 2 days later, I received the invitation to Dad's birthday. The release was not mentioned. That was why I went. I was married by then, but Aaron did not attend the dinner. He was a school counselor and had an evening program he could not leave without canceling on several students. More importantly, I did not want my first return to that dining room to become a performance about the man I had married after Grant. Aaron knew the history. He also knew that my family treated support as permission to speak for someone. He asked what I wanted him to do. I told him I wanted him to read whatever I brought home and tell me if I began doubting facts I had already verified. He agreed. The morning after Dad's birthday, I contacted Willow Creek House again. I still had the original vendor number, payment confirmations, and email chain connected to my account. The venue could not release every private communication from the master client file, but it provided the records tied to my payments, my personal data, and the amendment that removed my name as one of the honored parties. The amendment contained 4 words beneath the reason for change: bride substitution, family decision. The payment ledger showed my $12,600 transferred as existing credit toward the revised event. The date on my refusal email came 6 days before Dad signed the amendment. That was enough to establish 3 facts. I had objected before the wedding was changed. Dad continued the event anyway. My money reduced the balance Paige and Grant owed. I hired Evelyn Shaw, an estate attorney in Richmond, to represent me separately. She explained that Dad could claim I owed him money, but he could not transform that claim into an agreed estate deduction simply by placing it on a spreadsheet. If he believed I owed him, he would have to prove it. My signature on the birthday release would have made that much easier. The release also approved the discounted sale and waived my ability to question prior expenses. It was broader than anything Dad had described at the table. Evelyn advised me not to argue by phone. She sent a written request for the supporting invoices, the wedding agreement Dad claimed I had violated, and the basis for the cottage price. Dad replied that involving separate counsel was unnecessary and hostile. Mom called twice. I let both calls go to voicemail. Her second message said Paige had been crying since the birthday dinner. She asked whether I really wanted to destroy what remained of the family over paperwork. I saved the message. The following afternoon, Paige sent me a photograph of the cottage porch. She had placed 2 paint samples against the siding. Her message said she had already found a contractor who could start in spring. She planned to remove the screened porch, expand the kitchen, and rent the cottage during weeks her family was not using it. Paige did not have children, but she often spoke about the family she intended to have as though those future people already held claims against everyone around her. I replied that the estate had not transferred ownership and that she should not authorize work. She answered that Dad had approved preliminary planning. I forwarded the exchange to Evelyn and the estate attorney. That changed the next meeting. The estate attorney proposed that we meet at the cottage during a scheduled property inspection. The appraiser would attend to answer questions about value. Dad, Paige and I could address the sale in the place we were discussing instead of continuing through separate emails. I agreed. Dad objected at first. He said the family did not need to turn Grandma's home into a negotiation site. The estate attorney reminded him that the property belonged to the estate. A week later, we met at the cottage. The March air off the lake was cold enough to make the porch screens hum. Dad arrived first and unlocked the cottage with Grandma's old brass key. Paige and Grant pulled in behind him with a contractor's folder on the back seat of their SUV. Mom came even though she had no formal role in the estate. Evelyn and I arrived separately. The estate attorney stood near the kitchen table with the appraiser. A home inspector moved through the rooms, photographing the roofline, porch supports, electrical panel, and plumbing. Paige had placed small strips of blue painter's tape on several walls. One strip marked the place where she wanted to widen the kitchen opening. Another marked a cabinet she planned to remove. The cottage had not been distributed, sold, or approved for renovation. She had already begun labeling what she intended to change. When I asked who had given her permission to place the tape, Paige said she had not damaged anything. Dad told me not to create conflict over harmless planning. That was how the family worked. Paige acted. Dad softened the action. Mom questioned my reaction. I was expected to explain why the boundary existed. The appraiser reviewed his report at the kitchen table. The cottage required repairs, but the land and lake access carried most of the value. Comparable sales supported the $615,000 appraisal. Paige said those sales involved renovated properties. The appraiser explained that his adjustment already accounted for the condition. Dad asked about selling without an agent. The appraiser said avoiding commission might justify some negotiated difference, but not more than $200,000. Paige's offer was roughly 35% below the appraised value. She said value was not only financial. She had cared for Grandma. She had kept up the yard. She had been the person nearby when the refrigerator stopped working and when a storm damaged the dock railing. I told her I knew. That surprised her enough to interrupt the argument. I said I was not denying what she had done. I was not asking the estate to ignore her labor. If she had paid documented expenses for Grandma or the cottage, those expenses should be reviewed and reimbursed properly. What I would not do was give her part of my inheritance as an unofficial reward determined by Dad. Paige stared at me across the same kitchen table where we had eaten cereal as children. You left. I moved. You stopped answering us. I stopped accepting the version of events you had already agreed to. She said I had not been there when Grandma became weaker. I said that was true. The answer seemed to leave her without the argument she expected. I had missed ordinary days with Grandma that Paige had been present for. I regretted that. I could not rewrite it. But regret did not turn an equal will into an unequal one. The estate attorney brought the conversation back to the proposed sale. Paige could submit a market-supported offer with financing and inspection deadlines. If she could not, the estate would list the property. Dad said listing the cottage would destroy Grandma's legacy. The inspector came through the kitchen carrying a flashlight and asked Dad to move his papers away from the sink. Dad had brought another copy of the release. He placed it on the table after the inspector left. He said the cottage issue could not be separated from the wedding balance. According to him, he had used his money to satisfy obligations I created by canceling the event. The estate deduction simply recognized what had already happened. Evelyn asked for the agreement where I accepted responsibility for those costs. Dad said family arrangements were not always reduced to contracts. She asked for an email where I agreed. He said my repeated requests for an accounting proved I knew there was a balance. I removed 3 documents from my folder: my refusal email, the amendment, the payment ledger. I did not spread out every record I had saved. I placed the amendment in the center. Dad looked at the words bride substitution before looking at me. Paige said the phrase was administrative language chosen by the venue. I agreed. Administrative language was useful because it recorded what people chose after emotions changed. The amendment showed that Dad had replaced the bride and continued the contract. The ledger showed that my payments were transferred into Paige and Grant's final balance. The email showed that I had refused consent before the substitution occurred. Dad said he had been trying to prevent a greater financial loss. That part may have been true. He had signed the original venue contract. Canceling would have cost him money. Allowing Paige and Grant to use it reduced what he personally would lose. What he could not do was continue their wedding, approve their upgrades, apply my money to the balance, and later claim the entire event was a debt I had created. Mom said everybody had been under pressure. Paige said I was ignoring the fact that the wedding would never have existed without my plans. I asked whether that meant I should receive credit for choosing the venue, caterer, florist, and photographer. She called the question cruel. It was not a serious request. It was her logic carried in the opposite direction. Grant had remained near the window, looking toward the dock. He had said almost nothing since arriving. Paige turned toward him before Evelyn asked another question. "You told me she wanted nothing to do with any of it." Grant said I had told him to take his belongings and leave. He had never heard me give away the money. Paige said that was not what he had told her before the wedding. Grant looked at her then, not at me. He said she had been copied on one of the vendor emails and knew the payments were disputed. Paige denied opening it. Grant said she had forwarded the message to him and asked whether Dad could make the problem disappear. For the first time that day, Paige stopped arguing with me. She asked why Grant had kept the email. He said he had not saved it for leverage. It remained in the account because neither of them had expected the wedding records to become part of an estate dispute. Paige accused him of protecting himself. Grant said that was exactly what everyone in the room had done 5 years earlier. Dad told them to stop. Paige did not. She said Grant had assured her that I had rejected the wedding, the family, and everything connected to them. Grant said she had wanted to believe that version because it made using my deposits easier. Paige asked whether he was blaming her for a wedding he had agreed to. He said he was explaining why neither of them had ever asked me to sign anything. Their marriage did not collapse in front of us. Something less theatrical happened. For the first time, they could no longer tell the same story. Dad tried to pull the argument back under his control. He said none of this changed the amount he had paid. Evelyn asked for the invoices. The spreadsheet Dad provided listed one total. It had been created 9 days after Grandma died, almost 5 years after the wedding. The amount included services Paige and Grant had added after I was removed. The estate attorney compared the spreadsheet with the venue ledger. The numbers did not describe a loss caused by a canceled wedding. They described the cost of the wedding that took its place. Dad used one final argument. He said I had left the family to deal with the consequences. He said Paige stayed. He said I was using formalities to collect the same inheritance as the daughter who had shown up. There it was. The wedding debt and the cottage discount were never separate. Both came from the same verdict. Paige stayed, so her choices deserved protection. I left so my property could be used to balance whatever the family believed she deserved. I looked at the estate attorney. Can my father deduct this amount from my distribution without my agreement or a proven claim? He said no. Dad could pursue a separate claim if he wished. The estate would not treat the amount as an agreed beneficiary debt while I disputed it. I asked whether Paige's $400,000 offer could be approved without my consent. He said not under the current terms. Paige said I was forcing Grandma's home to strangers. I asked whether she would sell me her half for $200,000. She said that was different because she wanted the house. The appraiser closed his report. Nobody needed to explain the contradiction. My refusal to surrender value was greed. Her demand to receive that value was love. Dad gathered the release from the table. For the first time since his birthday, he did not push it back toward me. The estate attorney documented the meeting that afternoon. The proposed debt deduction was marked disputed and removed from the pending distribution calculation. Paige had 30 days to submit a revised offer supported by financing. Dad did not accept that quietly. Before Evelyn and I reached Richmond, he called my Aunt Rebecca and my Uncle Stephen. By evening, the family group chat contained a message from him. He said I had brought an attorney to Grandma's cottage, humiliated Paige in front of professionals, and threatened to force a public sale over a family disagreement. He did not mention the bride substitution form. He did not mention my $12,600. He said the wedding debt remained unresolved because I had refused every private attempt to discuss it. Aunt Rebecca replied that Grandma would not have wanted her house used to punish anyone. A cousin asked why an old wedding expense was being deducted from an inheritance. Dad answered that I had left him legally responsible for contracts he signed on my behalf. That wording mattered. The venue contract had been in his name because he paid the initial deposit. He had not signed it as my agent. He controlled it and later used that control to substitute Paige. I could have spent the evening correcting every sentence. Instead, I asked Evelyn what I could safely share. She recommended 3 pages with private information removed. The amendment, the payment ledger showing my credit, the refusal email with its timestamp. I attached them to the group chat with one message. Dad chose to continue the contract with Paige as the bride after I refused permission to transfer my payments. The estate deduction includes costs added to Paige and Grant's wedding 5 years later. Then I stopped responding. The first person to question Dad was not one of my supporters. It was Aunt Rebecca. She asked why the venue ledger showed my money reducing Paige's balance. Dad said family finances had been mixed together during a crisis. Uncle Stephen asked why the debt spreadsheet was dated 9 days after Grandma's death. Dad said the number had existed for years, but the accountant had formatted it later. My cousin asked whether there was any document showing I had agreed to repay him. Dad said families did not usually require signed contracts from their daughters. The argument exposed the problem more clearly than anything I could have written. He wanted the flexibility of a family understanding and the force of a legal debt. He wanted my consent to remain informal when he used my money, then become official when he deducted my inheritance. Mom called and left a voicemail asking me to remove the documents. She said Dad was furious and Paige had not stopped crying since the cottage meeting. She added that Grant was sleeping in their guest room because he and Paige were fighting over the old emails. That was the first consequence Paige mentioned that had nothing to do with me. Grant had not left her. They had not announced a separation. Their marriage had not collapsed into the dramatic punishment people enjoy imagining. But the agreement that had protected them for 5 years was gone. Paige believed Grant had minimized what I had said. Grant believed Paige had understood more than she admitted. Both blamed Dad for telling them he would handle it. Dad blamed me for forcing private decisions into records. I did not need to decide which one carried the most blame. The documents had room for all of them. 2 days later, Dad sent a longer email to the family. He described the wedding as a complicated emergency. He said he had been left with a contract and tried to create the least damaging outcome. He accused me of presenting selected documents without context. Then he repeated that I had abandoned the family during a crisis. The accusation was more careful than before, but it was still the same verdict. I replied once, "I moved after my money was transferred despite my written objection." Dad had my address, work email, and 3 requests for an accounting. I attached the requests. After that, Dad's brother called him. I learned about the conversation later from my mother. Uncle Stephen had asked Dad a simple question. If Lena had abandoned the debt, why had she repeatedly requested records showing what she supposedly owed? Dad did not have an answer that survived the dates. The family chat became quieter after that. Some relatives apologized. Some said nothing. A few continued insisting the matter should have remained private. The important change was that Dad could no longer repeat the old story without somebody asking for the documents. Paige's financing deadline came 3 weeks later. She and Grant submitted an offer closer to the appraisal, but they could not show sufficient funds for the down payment and the renovations they wanted without selling their current house. Their offer requested that the estate finance part of the purchase. I declined. Dad called that punitive. I said the estate was not a bank and I was not financing Paige's purchase of my share. The cottage was listed in April. The first weekend brought 3 offers. A family with 2 teenagers submitted the strongest one after inspection. The final price was slightly above the appraisal. Paige accused me of choosing strangers over family. I did not argue that the buyers deserved the cottage more than she did. They were simply willing and able to pay a fair price for property they did not already believe belonged to them. I cried after signing the closing documents. The cottage had held some of the best memories of my childhood. Selling it did not feel like revenge or liberation. It felt like losing a place because the people who wanted to preserve it could not agree that both owners mattered. Grief did not make the sale unfair. It made the loss real. The next estate accounting did not include the $41,800 deduction. Dad never filed a separate claim. A separate case would have required him to produce invoices, dates, testimony, and an explanation for why my money had paid Paige's wedding after I objected. 3 months after the closing, a check arrived from my parents. The amount was $12,600. The memo line read, "Wedding reimbursement." There was no letter. I deposited it. Returning money that belonged to me was not an apology, but refusing it would not have made me morally cleaner. The repayment fixed the amount. It did not fix the story. I told Dad that limited contact could resume only after he corrected the accusation with the same relatives who had heard it. He resisted for 6 weeks. First, he offered to explain the situation privately to anyone who asked. Then, he proposed telling the family that the debt had been resolved without saying who created it. His final version called the entire conflict a misunderstanding between both daughters. Each offer required me to accept part of the lie so he could avoid correcting the rest. I declined all 3. By then, the pressure no longer came only from me. Aunt Rebecca asked why Dad had told her for years that I left unpaid expenses when the ledger showed my money was used for Paige's wedding. Uncle Stephen asked whether Dad planned to pursue the alleged debt separately. When Dad said no, Stephen asked why the family should continue treating it as valid. Even Mom wanted the argument to end. The old version had started causing more embarrassment than a correction would. Dad finally sent a family email in June. It was not an apology. He described the situation as complicated. He said he had tried to protect both daughters during an emotional period and asked relatives not to judge decisions made years earlier. Then came one clear sentence. Lena did not leave us with unpaid wedding expenses. Funds she had paid were applied to Paige and Grant's wedding after she objected, and those funds have now been reimbursed. He sent the correction because the old story had become harder to defend than the truth. That did not make the sentence less important. For the first time, the family record matched the documents I had kept privately. Aunt Rebecca forwarded the email to me with a short apology. I thanked her. I did not ask who else believed me now. Dad and I began with one scheduled phone call each month. Mom joined occasionally. During one call, she admitted that she had known about the affair before I did and had protected Paige from the consequences of telling me. She did not call it keeping the peace. She called it cowardly. That was enough for one conversation. Paige never apologized. Her last message said she hoped I was satisfied now that Grandma's cottage belonged to strangers and her marriage had been dragged through a family dispute. I did not answer. I had not created the emails Grant kept. I had not told him to minimize my refusal, and I had not asked Paige to forward a vendor message asking whether Dad could make the problem disappear. Their marriage remained intact as far as I knew. but they stopped presenting themselves as two people who had innocently inherited a financial mess created by me. Grant sent one email several months later. He admitted that he had allowed Paige to believe I had rejected everything connected to the wedding because that version made their decision easier. He did not ask for forgiveness. I archived the message. Aaron and I used part of the inheritance to reduce our mortgage and saved the rest. Nothing about my life became grand enough to function as revenge. That was not what changed. What changed was the next time my parents invited me home. Mom asked whether I was available for Thanksgiving. She did not say Grandma would have wanted it. She did not tell me the family needed me, she asked. I agreed to come for 4 hours. I brought one pie. I did not plan the meal, coordinate arrival times, or remain behind to clean after everyone else left. Paige and Grant spent the holiday with his family. After dinner, Dad brought out a contractor estimate for a leak near the garage. For a moment, he held it toward me the way he used to hand me every family problem. Then he stopped. Would you have time to look at this next week? I told him to email it, and I would decide after checking my schedule. The difference was small enough that nobody else at the table noticed. I did. For years, my family had treated my competence as open access. My ability to handle something meant they did not need permission before placing it in my hands. The unsigned release changed that. It was the document they needed to turn 5 years of accusation into a debt I had officially accepted. I still keep a scanned copy beside the bride substitution amendment and the payment ledger. The blank signature line records the first time my family built a decision around my consent and discovered they could not supply it themselves. They had used my absence as agreement. They had used my strength as an excuse. They had used my inheritance as a collection account for a debt they invented. The release remained unsigned. And after that, they had to ask, if your family called you selfish for refusing a debt you never created, would you keep explaining yourself or ask them to prove it?